Eichard Whitmore stood outside his daughter's bedroom door, listening to sounds that broke his heart. Crying. Deep, gulping sobs that seemed to have no end. This was day 3. 3 days of his 7-year-old daughter refusing to eat, barely drinking water and crying until she had no tears left. Then crying some more. He pushed open the door gently. Sophie lay curled on her bed, her face buried in a pillow that was damp from tears. Her small body shook with each sob. Richard walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, placing his hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away, but she didn't respond either. It was like touching a statue that happened to be crying. "Sophie, please," Richard said, knowing she couldn't hear him. Her cochlear implant sat on the nightstand, turned off. She'd removed it the day her grandmother died and refused to put it back on. Without it, his daughter lived in complete silence. And in that silence, she was drowning in grief. Richard had tried everything. He'd brought in child psychologists who specialized in deaf children. He'd hired grief counselors with impressive degrees and long lists of success stories. He'd even flown in a specialist from California who'd written 3 books on childhood trauma. None of them could reach Sophie. She wouldn't look at them, wouldn't communicate. Just cried and cried until Richard thought his own heart might break from listening to it. Sophie's grandmother had died suddenly last week. A heart attack while gardening. One moment she was planting roses, the next she was gone. It happened so fast that nobody had time to prepare, especially not Sophie. Richard's wife, Sophie's mother, had died when Sophie was only 2 years old. Cancer, quick and merciless. Sophie barely remembered her, but she remembered her grandmother. That woman had been everything to Sophie. The person who learned sign language fluently just to talk with her. The person who made Sophie feel special instead of different. The person who understood her world because she took the time to enter it. Now she was gone, and Sophie had lost the second most important woman in her life. Richard felt helpless in a way that money couldn't fix. He was a billionaire. He owned 3 companies. He could buy almost anything, solve almost any problem, but he couldn't bring back his daughter's grandmother. He couldn't stop her crying. He couldn't even communicate with her properly because he'd never fully learned sign language. That thought sat heavy in his chest. He'd paid for the best schools, the best therapists, the best technology. He'd given Sophie every advantage money could buy, but he'd never learned to speak her primary language. He knew a few basic signs. "I love you. Good morning. Are you hungry?" Basics that any parent could learn in a weekend workshop. But real conversation? Deep communication? He relied on interpreters for that. Or on Sophie's ability to read lips, which was excellent but not the same as someone speaking her native language. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Patterson, his household manager, stood in the hallway with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation with the staff." Richard stood up, careful not to jostle Sophie too much. He stepped into the hallway, pulling the door partially closed behind him. "What kind of situation?" "It's about Clara Johnson, one of the housekeeping staff. She's been asking about Sophie, repeatedly. She wants permission to see her." Richard frowned. Clara Johnson? The name was vaguely familiar. He'd seen her around the house pushing a cleaning cart, always working quietly and efficiently. But he couldn't picture her face clearly. In a house with 15 staff members, it was hard to know everyone personally. "Why would she want to see Sophie?" Richard asked, confused. "She says she might be able to help. I've explained that we have professional therapists handling the situation, but she's quite insistent. I told her it was inappropriate for staff to involve themselves in family matters, but she asked me to at least pass along her request to you." Richard's first reaction was to say no. What could a housekeeper possibly do that trained psychologists couldn't? It seemed presumptuous, maybe even inappropriate. His daughter was grieving, not in need of cleaning services. But then he thought about Sophie crying in that room, unreachable by all the experts he'd hired. What did he have to lose? "Send her up," Richard said. Mrs. Patterson looked surprised, but nodded and walked away. 5 minutes later, footsteps approached. Richard turned to see a black woman in her mid-50s walking toward him. She wore the standard housekeeping uniform and her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was kind but serious, and her eyes held something Richard couldn't quite name. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this is unusual. Mrs. Patterson said you wanted to help Sophie. I don't understand how. May I be direct, sir? Richard nodded, surprised by her calm confidence. I lost my hearing when I was 7 years old. Meningitis. And I lost my mother when I was 8. I understand what your daughter is experiencing in ways that hearing people, even well-meaning professionals, might not. Richard stared at her. You're deaf? I was profoundly deaf for most of my life. I got a cochlear implant 5 years ago, after saving for 15 years, but I grew up in silence, Mr. Whitmore. I learned to navigate the world without sound, and I grieved my mother while feeling completely isolated because nobody around me could truly communicate with me. But you can hear now? You're speaking to me. The implant helps, and I've always been good at reading lips. But my first language is American Sign Language. It's still how I think, how I dream. And I suspect it's the language your daughter needs right now. The language of someone who understands her world. Richard felt something crack open in his chest. This woman, someone he'd barely noticed in 6 months of employment, understood his daughter better than he did. What would you do? He asked. If you give me permission, I'd like to sit with her. Not as a therapist. Not with any agenda. Just sit with her and let her know she's not alone. That someone sees her. Someone who's walked the path she's walking. Richard thought about all the therapists who'd tried structured approaches, therapeutic techniques, carefully planned interventions. All of them had failed. Maybe what Sophie needed wasn't technique. Maybe she needed connection. All right, Richard said, but I'll be right outside the door. Clara nodded and walked past him into Sophie's room. Richard watched from the doorway as she approached his daughter's bed. Sophie didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the new presence. She just kept crying into her pillow. Clara didn't try to touch Sophie or force her attention. She simply sat down on the floor beside the bed. Not on the bed, not hovering over the child, just nearby, present. Then Clara's hands began to move. Richard felt his breath catch. She was signing. Her hands moved with beautiful, fluid grace, telling a story in American Sign Language. The movements were expressive, almost like dance. Even not understanding the language, Richard could see the emotion in every gesture. Sophie's crying began to slow. Her face was still buried in the pillow, but Richard could tell she was paying attention. Deaf children learn to listen with their eyes, to feel vibrations, to sense presence in ways hearing people don't. Sophie knew someone was there, signing to her. Slowly, very slowly, Sophie lifted her head slightly. Her eyes were swollen and red, her face blotchy from crying. She looked at Clara's moving hands with the wary hope of a wounded animal that's been hurt too many times to trust easily. Clara continued signing, her expression gentle and understanding. She didn't smile too brightly or try to force cheerfulness. She just communicated, telling a story that Richard couldn't understand, but that was clearly reaching his daughter. After several minutes, Sophie sat up fully. She wiped her face with her sleeve and watched Clara's hands with complete attention. Clara was still signing, still telling her story. Then Sophie's own hands moved. Small, shaky movements. She was signing back, Richard's vision blurred with tears. His daughter was communicating. After 3 days of complete shutdown, she was responding to this woman she'd never met before. The conversation continued for several minutes. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. Finally, Clara opened her arms slightly, and Sophie fell forward into them. The child began crying again, but different tears this time. Not the silent, isolated sobbing of before. These were tears of being understood, of being seen, of being held by someone who knew what it felt like to hurt the way she was hurting. Clara held Sophie and rocked her gently, one hand rubbing circles on the child's back. Her other hand made signs against Sophie's back where the girl could feel the rhythm even if she couldn't see the words. Richard turned away, overwhelmed by emotion. He walked down the hallway, found a bathroom, and let himself cry. Great heaving sobs that he'd been holding back for days, crying for his daughter's pain, crying for his own helplessness, crying because a housekeeper he barely knew had reached his daughter in less than an hour, when trained professionals had failed for 3 days. When he'd composed himself and returned to Sophie's room, he found his daughter sitting up in bed, still holding Clara's hand. Sophie's face was calmer than Richard had seen it in days. She looked exhausted but present, connected to the world again instead of lost in grief. Clara looked up at Richard and spoke quietly. She's agreed to drink some water and maybe eat a little something. Small steps? How did you do that? Richard asked, his voice rough. Clara stood up but kept one hand on Sophie's shoulder. I didn't do anything special, Mr. Whitmore. I just spoke her language. I let her know that she's not alone in her experience, that someone else has survived what she's surviving. Will you come back tomorrow? Richard asked. Please? Clara nodded. I'll come after my shift ends. Around 6, if that's all right with Sophie. Sophie looked at her father, then back at Clara, and nodded. Clara returned the next evening at 6 o'clock exactly, still wearing her housekeeping uniform. Richard met her at the door and for the first time really looked at her. He'd walked past this woman dozens of times in 6 months and never truly seen her. Now he noticed the kindness in her eyes, the quiet strength in the way she carried herself, the gentle confidence of someone who'd survived hard things and came out softer, not harder. Sophie's been asking for you, Richard said. Well, signing for you. She's been sitting by the window watching for you since 5:30. Clara smiled. That's a good sign. Anticipation means hope. Hope is the first step back to living. They walked upstairs together. Sophie was indeed sitting by her window, and when she saw Clara, her face brightened. Not a full smile yet, but something close. She scrambled off the window seat and rushed over. Clara knelt down to Sophie's level and signed something. Sophie signed back rapidly, her small hands moving with energy that had been absent for days. Richard watched them, understanding nothing of the conversation but everything about the connection. What's she saying? Richard asked. Clara glanced up. She's telling me about her grandmother, about the things they used to do together. She wants to know if I think her grandmother can still see her from heaven. What did you tell her? I told her that love doesn't die when people die. It changes form, but it doesn't disappear, and that her grandmother's love lives inside her now in every memory, every lesson, every moment they shared. Richard felt his throat tighten. That's beautiful. It's also true, Clara said simply. At least it's what got me through losing my mother. Over the next week, Clara came every evening after finishing her work. Sometimes she and Sophie would sit and sign for hours. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence just being together. Clara brought photo albums from her own life, showing Sophie pictures of her childhood, her family, her journey through deafness and grief and survival. One evening, Richard worked up the courage to ask if he could join them. Clara and Sophie were sitting on the floor of Sophie's room, looking at a book about deaf culture. They both looked up when he knocked. Clara signed something to Sophie, who nodded. She says you can come in. Richard sat down awkwardly, feeling like an outsider in his own daughter's life. Clara was showing Sophie pictures of famous deaf people. Athletes, artists, actors, scientists. People who'd thrived, not despite being deaf, but as deaf individuals with unique perspectives and abilities. I never thought to show her this, Richard admitted. I was so focused on helping her fit into the hearing world that I never considered there was a whole deaf world she could belong to. Clara looked at him with gentle understanding. It's not your fault, Mr. Whitmore. Most hearing parents don't know deaf culture exists. They think of deafness as something to fix or overcome, but it's actually an identity, a community, a rich culture with its own language and traditions. How do I learn? Richard asked. How do I become part of her world instead of always expecting her to be part of mine? You learn sign language, not just survival signs. Real fluency. You learn about deaf history and culture. You meet deaf adults and let Sophie see successful deaf people living full lives. You stop thinking of her deafness as a problem and start seeing it as a difference that makes her unique. Richard looked at his daughter, who was watching his face intently, reading his lips. I've been doing this all wrong, haven't I? Clara shook her head. You've been doing your best with the information you had. Now you have new information. What matters is what you do next. That night after Clara left, Richard called his assistant. I need you to find me the best ASL instructor in New York. I don't care what it costs. I want lessons every day. And find me books on deaf culture. Everything available. I want to understand my daughter's world. The next morning before work, Richard had his first ASL lesson. The instructor, a deaf woman named Beth, was patient but demanding. She made him practice the same signs over and over until his hands ached and his brain felt like mush. You're thinking in English and trying to translate, Beth signed, her interpreter voicing the words. You need to think in ASL. It's a completely different language with different grammar, different structure. Stop translating. Start thinking visually. It was harder than anything Richard had ever learned. Harder than calculus, harder than business strategy, harder than any skill he'd acquired building his empire. His hands felt clumsy. His brain kept wanting to structure sentences the English way. He mixed up signs, forgot vocabulary, got frustrated with himself, but he kept practicing. Every morning before work, every evening after dinner, he carried flashcards everywhere. He watched ASL videos on his phone during business meetings, practicing fingerspelling under the table where nobody could see. Sophie watched her father's efforts with cautious interest. One evening, about 2 weeks after Clara first visited, Richard approached Sophie's room where she and Clara were having their usual visit. He knocked and signed slowly and carefully, "May I join you?" His signing was terrible. His hand shapes were wrong, his movements awkward. But it was real. He was trying to speak her language. Sophie's eyes went wide. She looked at Clara, who nodded encouragingly. Then Sophie signed back, slowly so her father could understand. "Yes, sit with us." Richard sat down, feeling like a student in the presence of masters. Clara had been teaching Sophie more advanced signs, helping her understand the nuances of the language. Now she included Richard in the lesson, patiently correcting his mistakes, showing him the right way to form each sign. "Your dad is working very hard," Clara signed to Sophie. "Learning a new language as an adult is difficult, but he's trying because he loves you." Sophie looked at her father with something Richard hadn't seen in her eyes in a long time. Not just love, but respect. Pride, even. Her dad, who ran companies and made millions, was humbling himself to learn her language. That night after Clara left, Richard tucked Sophie into bed. He signed clumsily but earnestly, "I love you. I'm sorry I never learned this before." "I'm learning now," Sophie signed back. "I know, Daddy. Thank you for trying." Then she reached out and hugged him, squeezing tight. Richard held his daughter and felt like maybe, finally, he was starting to become the father she needed. Over the following weeks, something fundamental shifted in the Whitmore household. Richard continued his intensive ASL studies, spending every spare moment practicing. He started joining Clara and Sophie every evening, learning not just language but culture. Clara brought her teenage son Daniel to meet Sophie one Saturday. Daniel was born deaf and was completely comfortable with his identity. He signed with expressive enthusiasm that made Sophie giggle. It was the first real laugh Richard had heard from his daughter since her grandmother died. "Being deaf is just part of who I am," Daniel signed to Sophie, "like having brown eyes or being tall. It's not good or bad, it just is. And actually, I think it's pretty cool because I know a secret language that most people don't understand." Sophie's face lit up with understanding. She'd spent so much of her life trying to hear better, speak more clearly, fit into the hearing world. Daniel was showing her a different way, a way where being deaf was normal, even cool. After Daniel and Clara left that afternoon, Sophie came to find her father in his study. She signed, "Dad, can we go to deaf events?" Clara says there are gatherings and picnics. Richard signed back, still slowly but more confidently than before. "Yes, we'll go together. You can teach me." Sophie smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and made them shine. The next weekend, Clara took them to a deaf community picnic in Central Park. Richard felt completely out of his element. Everyone was signing rapidly, conversations happening simultaneously in visual space. He caught maybe one word in 10, but Sophie transformed. She lit up, signing with other deaf children, making friends, belonging to something bigger than herself. Richard watched his daughter blossom and realized what he'd been denying her. Community, connection, with people who understood her experience without explanation. An older deaf man approached Richard and signed something. Richard stared blankly, then looked around for help. Clara appeared and interpreted. "He's asking if you're Sophie's father. He says you're doing a good thing, learning sign language. He wishes more hearing parents would make the effort." Richard signed back with Clara's help. "I should have learned years ago. I'm trying to make up for lost time." The man signed, "Better late than never. Your daughter is lucky to have a father willing to learn." That evening on the drive home, Sophie signed from the back seat, "Today was the best day I've had since Grandma died." Richard glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "I'm glad. We'll go back, as often as you want." "Can Clara come to dinner tomorrow? I want her to teach me more signs." "Clara is welcome anytime," Richard said, and meant it. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Richard found Clara in the kitchen. She'd stayed to help Sophie with a project and was now gathering her things to leave. "Clara, I want to offer you a different position. As Sophie's companion, full-time, triple your current salary." Clara set down her bag and looked at him steadily. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate the offer, but I have to be honest with you. I'm not interested." Richard was taken aback. "But you're so good with Sophie. You've helped her in ways nobody else could. Why wouldn't you?" "Because Sophie doesn't need a paid companion," Clara said gently but firmly. "She needs genuine relationships. She needs her father to learn her language and enter her world. She needs to be part of the deaf community. She needs people who see her as a whole person, not a job or a project. I'm trying to do those things, I know you are. And you're doing well. But Mr. Whitmore, if you hire me as Sophie's companion, you might stop trying so hard yourself. You might rely on me to bridge the gap instead of building that bridge yourself. Sophie needs you, her father, to be fluent in her language. Not just capable, fluent." Richard felt the words hit like a gentle slap. "You're right. I was taking the easy way out, wasn't I? You were trying to help your daughter the best way you knew how. I'm just suggesting that the best help you can give is your own presence, your own effort, your own willingness to change." Clara picked up her bag again. "I'll keep visiting Sophie after work. Not because you're paying me, but because I care about her, because she needs someone who understands her experience. But you need to do the hard work, Mr. Whitmore. Learn ASL until you dream in signs. Become active in the deaf community. Make your home and your businesses more accessible. Show Sophie through actions, not just words or money, that her world matters." After Clara left, Richard sat alone in his kitchen thinking about everything she'd said. She was right. He'd been trying to buy a solution instead of becoming the solution, trying to hire someone to fix his relationship with his daughter instead of fixing it himself. The next morning, Richard doubled his ASL lessons, and he made a decision that would change everything. 3 months after Clara first sat with Sophie, Richard made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He announced he was taking a 6-month sabbatical from his company to focus on his daughter. His board of directors thought he'd lost his mind. His business partners worried about the company's future. His friends told him it was career suicide. Richard didn't care. For the first time in his life, something mattered more than business. He used those 6 months to become truly fluent in ASL. Not just conversational, but fluent. He studied for hours every day. He attended deaf events constantly, immersing himself in the language and culture. He hired only deaf instructors, forcing himself to adapt to their world instead of expecting them to adapt to his. The change in his relationship with Sophie was profound. They could finally have real conversations. Deep conversations. She told him about her feelings, her fears, her memories of her grandmother. She shared things she'd never been able to express before because the communication barrier had been too great. One evening, about 4 months into Richard's sabbatical, Sophie signed something that made his breath catch. "Dad, I'm scared I'll forget what Grandma's signing looked like." Richard hadn't thought about that. Hearing people could remember voices, but deaf people remembered hands, expressions, the unique way each person signed. "Tell me about how she signed." Richard signed back. "Describe it to me." She had gentle hands, soft. She always signed like she was telling secrets, even when she wasn't. And when she signed "I love you," she'd hold the sign extra long, like she was giving me a hug with her hands. Richard felt tears on his face. "That's beautiful. That's a memory worth keeping. But what if I forget? What if one day I can't remember anymore?" Richard thought for a moment, then signed. "We can write it down. All your memories of Grandma. How she signed, what those signs meant to you. We can make a book so you'll always remember." Sophie's face lit up. "Can we, really? We can start tonight." They spent the next several weeks creating a memory book. Sophie would tell Richard her memories and he'd write them down. Then Clara, who visited regularly, would help them find ways to describe the visual memories. How Grandma's hands moved when she told stories. The way her face expressed emotions. The special signs she'd invented just for Sophie. It became a healing project for both of them. Richard learned more about his late mother-in-law than he'd ever known while she was alive. Sophie processed her grief by honoring her grandmother's memory in tangible ways. Clara watched them work together one evening and signed to Richard. "You've come so far. Look at you now, having deep conversations with your daughter in her native language. I'm proud of you." "I should have done this years ago," Richard signed back. "Maybe, but you're doing it now. That's what matters. Around this time, Richard started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. How inaccessible his world was for deaf people. Meetings conducted entirely through speech with no interpreters. Business calls without video options. Presentations without captions. He'd built an empire that excluded an entire community without even realizing it. He started making changes, hiring deaf employees, providing ASL interpreters for all company meetings, adding captions to every video and presentation, making accessibility a priority, not an afterthought. One day, a deaf employee named Vincent approached Richard after a meeting and signed, "Thank you for making these changes. I've worked at 5 different companies, and this is the first place I've felt truly included." That conversation shifted something in Richard. He realized he had the resources and influence to make real change, not just in his company but in the broader community. He started planning something bigger, a foundation, something that would honor Sophie, honor Clara's impact on their lives, and help other deaf children and their families. But before any of those plans could take shape, something happened that changed everything. It was a Saturday afternoon. Richard had taken Sophie and Clara to the Museum of Natural History. They were looking at the dinosaur exhibits, Sophie's favorite. She was animatedly signing about T-Rexes and velociraptors, her face bright with excitement. Then suddenly, Sophie's hand went to her head, her face contorted with pain. Her eyes went wide with confusion and fear. Clara noticed first. "Sophie, what's wrong?" she signed. Sophie tried to respond, but her hands faltered. She swayed on her feet, her expression clouding with confusion. Then her eyes rolled back and her knees buckled. Richard lunged forward and caught her just before she hit the ground. "Sophie, Sophie," he was shouting, though some part of his brain knew she couldn't hear him. Clara was already pulling out her phone, dialing 911. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady as she gave the dispatcher their location and explained what happened. A crowd gathered around them. Someone who identified as a nurse knelt down to help. Richard held his unconscious daughter in his arms, feeling more terrified than he'd ever been in his life. This couldn't be happening. They'd just gotten to a good place. They'd just learned to communicate. This couldn't be happening. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics took over, checking Sophie's vitals, asking questions Richard could barely process. Yes, she was deaf. Yes, she had a cochlear implant. No recent illnesses. No, she'd never had seizures before. They loaded Sophie onto a stretcher. Richard climbed into the ambulance with her. Clara followed in a taxi, refusing to leave them alone. At the hospital, doctors rushed Sophie into imaging, CT scans, MRIs. Richard paced the waiting room, signing prayers he'd never learned properly, bargaining with a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Clara sat calmly in a chair, but Richard could see her hands trembling. She was scared too, for this child she'd helped save from grief, who'd become like family to her. After what felt like hours but was probably only 90 minutes, a neurologist came out. His face was serious. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to speak with you about your daughter's condition." Richard's heart dropped into his stomach. "What's wrong with her?" "Sophie has a brain aneurysm. It's a weakening in the wall of an artery in her brain. We believe it's congenital, meaning she was born with it. It's been growing slowly over time, and the pressure has reached a critical point. That's what caused her to collapse, and what does that mean? What do we do?" The doctor's expression remained grave. "We need to operate immediately. If the aneurysm ruptures, she could die or suffer severe brain damage. But I need to be honest with you, the surgery itself carries significant risks." "What kind of risks?" "There's a chance of stroke, further hearing loss, vision problems, cognitive impacts. And there's always the risk that comes with any brain surgery. But without the surgery, the aneurysm will almost certainly rupture. We're looking at a 65% chance of successful outcome with minimal complications. Those are good odds, but they're not guarantees." Richard felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "Can I see her first? Before surgery?" "She's still unconscious, but yes, you can see her briefly." Sophie ran around with other deaf kids, signing rapidly, laughing loudly, completely at ease. Richard watched her with joy so profound it almost hurt. This was his daughter, healthy, happy, thriving, surrounded by people who understood and celebrated her. Clara appeared beside him and signed, "She's come so far." "We all have," Richard signed back. "Thanks to you. I didn't do this," Clara signed. You did the hard work. You learned her language. You entered her world. You became the father she needed. But you showed me how. You saved her from grief when I couldn't reach her. You saved her life by getting help so fast when she collapsed. You taught me what it means to really see someone. Clara smiled and signed. I saw a child who needed understanding. I saw a father who needed guidance. I did what anyone should do when they see someone struggling. I helped. It was more than help. It was heroic. Clara shook her head firmly. Heroic is too big a word. I just shared what I knew from living through similar pain. That's what community does. We share our experiences to help others survive theirs. At that moment, a deaf woman approached them, a small child by her side. She signed to Richard. Are you Mr. Whitmore? Yes, Richard signed back. Thank you for organizing this event. My daughter was just diagnosed as deaf 3 months ago. We've been struggling, feeling lost. But being here today, seeing all these happy deaf people, successful deaf adults, deaf kids thriving, it gives us hope. It shows us that our daughter can have a full, beautiful life. Richard glanced at Sophie, who was teaching some younger kids a signing game. She absolutely can. Being deaf isn't a tragedy. It's a different way of experiencing the world, and there's so much beauty in that difference. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Everyone keeps telling us to focus on making her hear, making her speak. But you're the first person who's told us it's okay for her to be deaf. It's more than okay, Richard signed. It's who she is. Love her for who she is, learn her language, and connect her with deaf community. That's what she needs most. After the woman walked away, Clara signed to Richard. You've become a good advocate. Sophie would be proud. I'm trying to use my privilege and resources for good, to help other families avoid the mistakes I made. To make the world more accessible for deaf people. That's exactly what we need, Clara signed. Hearing people with power and influence who actually listen to the deaf community and support our needs. As the day went on, Richard found himself in dozens of conversations with deaf individuals and their families. Parents seeking advice, deaf adults sharing their experiences, teachers discussing educational approaches. He listened more than he spoke, learning constantly, understanding that he still had so much to learn. That evening, after all the guests had left, Richard sat with Sophie and Clara on the back patio, watching the sunset. Sophie signed, Today was perfect. I felt like I belonged to something bigger than just me. You do belong, Richard signed. To the deaf community. To our family. To this world that's better because you're in it. Sophie leaned against her father's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her. Clara watched them with satisfaction, knowing her role in their journey had shifted from necessity to choice. She was family now, not because of crisis, but because of genuine love and connection. You know what's amazing? Richard signed to Clara. 6 months ago, I thought I knew everything. I thought money could solve any problem. I thought my way was the right way. You taught me that I knew nothing. That real wisdom comes from listening to people who live experiences different from your own. You were teachable, Clara signed. That's a rare quality in powerful people. Most would have dismissed me as just a housekeeper. But you listened. You changed. You grew. That's what made the difference. Sophie sat up and signed. I want to tell you both something. When Grandma died, I thought I would never be happy again. I thought the world was too dark and too quiet and too sad. But you both taught me that grief doesn't have to destroy you, that you can survive losing someone and still find joy, still find purpose, still find reasons to keep living. Your grandmother would be so proud of you, Clara signed, of your strength, your resilience, your compassion for others. I want to help kids like me, Sophie signed again, kids who feel alone or scared. I want to be for them what you were for me, Auntie Clara, someone who understands, someone who's been there. Richard felt his heart swell. His daughter, who'd survived so much loss and pain, wanted to turn her experience into something that would help others. That was true strength, true courage. We'll make that happen, Richard signed. The foundation I'm starting, you can be part of it. When you're older, you can mentor young deaf kids. Show them that they can thrive. That being deaf is something to be proud of. Sophie's face lit up. Really, I can do that? Absolutely. You have wisdom beyond your years, Sophie. Wisdom earned through suffering and survival. That's valuable. That can help other people. As darkness fell and the city lights began to twinkle below, the three of them sat in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that deaf people know isn't empty at all. It's full of understanding, connection, love communicated through presence rather than sound. Richard thought about where they'd been 6 months ago. Sophie crying inconsolably, him unable to reach her, both of them trapped on opposite sides of a language barrier. Now they could communicate fluently. Now they understood each other. Now they were truly family. All because a housekeeper named Clara had seen a suffering child and refused to look away. Because she'd had the courage to insert herself where she wasn't technically welcome, to offer help that wasn't technically her job to give. That was real heroism, not the loud, flashy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that sees pain and responds with compassion, the kind that shares hard-won wisdom to spare others from walking the same difficult path alone. Richard signed to Clara, "I can never repay what you did for us." Clara signed back, "You don't repay kindness. You pass it forward. You take what you learned and use it to help others. That's how we heal the world. One connection at a time." 1 year after Clara first sat with Sophie, Richard stood at a podium in front of 200 people. Donors, community leaders, deaf activists, families with deaf children. They'd gathered for the official launch of the Sophie Whitmore Foundation for Deaf Empowerment. The event had ASL interpreters, live captioning on large screens, and every accessibility accommodation possible. Richard had learned that true inclusion meant thinking about accessibility from the start, not adding it as an afterthought. He began his speech in sign language, speaking simultaneously so both deaf and hearing audience members could follow. 1 year ago, I was a father who couldn't communicate with his own daughter. I'd given her every material advantage, the best medical care, the best education, the best technology, but I couldn't have a real conversation with her because I'd never bothered to learn her language. He paused, looking at Sophie sitting in the front row next to Clara. Then my daughter's grandmother died, and Sophie fell into a grief so deep I thought I might lose her too. 17 trained professionals tried to help. None of them could reach her. Then a housekeeper named Clara Johnson asked for permission to sit with my daughter. I almost said no. What could a housekeeper possibly do that trained therapists couldn't? The audience was completely silent, both deaf and hearing people riveted by his story. Clara sat with Sophie and did something revolutionary. She spoke Sophie's language. She shared her own story of growing up deaf and losing her mother young. She showed Sophie that survival was possible, that healing was possible, that she wasn't alone. Richard's voice cracked slightly. Clara saved my daughter twice. Once from drowning in grief, and months later, when Sophie collapsed from a brain aneurysm, Clara's quick action and calm response helped save her life. But more than that, Clara taught me how to be the father Sophie needed. She taught me that understanding matters more than providing, that learning someone's language is an act of love, that deaf people don't need to be fixed, they need to be seen, celebrated and included. The audience erupted in applause, hands waving in the air in the deaf community's way of showing appreciation. Richard continued, "This foundation exists because of Clara's wisdom and Sophie's courage. We're not just providing services, we're building community. We offer free ASL classes for families with deaf children. We connect deaf kids with deaf adult mentors. We fund deaf-led programs and deaf-owned businesses. We advocate for accessibility in schools, workplaces, and public spaces. We celebrate deaf culture and identity." He signed the next part with particular emphasis. "We recognize that deafness is not a disability to overcome, but a cultural identity to embrace. That sign language is not a lesser form of communication, but a beautiful, complex language worthy of respect. That deaf people don't need to be made hearing. They need to be heard." More applause. Sophie was crying, signing to Clara. Clara hugged her close. "Most importantly," Richard continued, "this foundation is led by deaf people. Clara Johnson is our Director of Community Programs. Our board is majority deaf. Our staff is at least 50% deaf. Because deaf people know what deaf people need. My role is to provide resources and use my privilege to open doors. But deaf voices lead this work." After the formal speeches, people mingled. Richard found himself in conversation after conversation with parents of deaf children, deaf adults sharing their experiences, educators discussing best practices. A young mother approached him, tears streaming down her face. She held a toddler who wore small hearing aids. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "My son was diagnosed deaf 6 months ago. I've been grieving like he died. Everyone tells me to focus on making him hear, on speech therapy, on fixing him. But your foundation sent someone to talk to me. A deaf woman with a PhD and a successful career. She told me my son could have a full, beautiful life as a deaf person. She taught me that I needed to learn ASL, not force my son to become hearing. You saved me from making my son feel broken. Richard felt emotion rise in his throat. Your son isn't broken. He's perfect as he is. Learn his language. Connect him with deaf community. Let him be proud of who he is. The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. We start ASL classes next week. Our whole family. We're going to enter his world instead of forcing him into ours. That's exactly right, Richard said. That's what he needs most. Throughout the evening, similar conversations happened everywhere. Parents finding hope, deaf adults feeling seen and valued, community being built. Sophie spent the evening with other deaf kids, signing rapidly, laughing, completely in her element. At one point, Richard watched her explaining to a younger deaf child what a cochlear implant was, how it helped her but didn't make her hearing, how it was okay to be deaf with or without technology. Clara appeared beside Richard and signed. She's a natural advocate. She learned from the best. Richard signed back. She learned from surviving, from being seen, from understanding that her experience has value and can help others. Richard looked around the room at all these people connected by language, culture, and shared experience. A year ago, he'd known nothing about deaf culture. Now he was deeply embedded in this community, learning constantly, using his resources to support their needs and amplify their voices. Over the following months, the foundation grew rapidly. They provided scholarships for deaf students, funded deaf artists and entrepreneurs, created mentorship programs pairing deaf kids with successful deaf adults, offered free ASL classes in community centers across the city, worked with schools to improve deaf education, advocated for policy changes to increase accessibility. But for Richard, the most meaningful work happened in smaller, quieter moments, like when he visited a family with a newly diagnosed deaf baby and could assure them from personal experience that their child would be okay, that they could learn to communicate beautifully. That deaf culture was rich and vibrant and worth embracing. Or when he attended deaf community events not as a donor or founder, but as a father and community member, playing with deaf kids, signing with deaf adults, being part of something bigger than himself. Or the evenings at home with Sophie, signing about her day, her dreams, her thoughts. Real conversations, deep connections. The relationship he'd always wanted but hadn't known how to build. Sophie thrived. At school, she excelled academically and socially. She performed in deaf theater productions. She wrote poetry in ASL that was filmed and shared online. She started a blog for deaf kids offering advice and encouragement. At age 8, she was already changing lives. One evening, about 18 months after her surgery, Sophie came to Richard's study. She signed, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" "Of how we've changed?" Richard felt his eyes sting. "I think your mom would be incredibly proud. Proud of how brave you've been. Proud that I finally learned to be the father you deserved. Proud that we're using our experience to help other families." "I miss her," Sophie signed. "And I miss Grandma. But I'm not sad all the time anymore." "Is that okay?" "That's more than okay, sweetheart. That's healing. That's what they'd want for you. To live fully, to find joy, to honor their memory by living well." Sophie climbed into his lap even though she was getting too big for it. Richard held her, signing against her back where she could feel the rhythm. "I love you. I'm so proud of you. You've taught me more than I ever taught you." 2 years after Clara first entered their lives, Richard hosted another event, a celebration of the Foundation's impact. They'd served over 500 families, provided ASL training to 2,000 hearing parents, connected 300 deaf kids with deaf mentors, funded 15 deaf-owned businesses, changed lives across the city. But the real measure of success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the faces of parents who could finally communicate with their children, in deaf kids who felt proud of their identity instead of broken, in a community that felt seen, valued, and supported. Clara stood at the microphone, signing her own speech. Richard interpreted for the hearing audience. 2 years ago, I was a housekeeper watching a child suffer. I saw myself in her. I saw my younger self, grief-stricken and isolated, feeling like nobody understood. I couldn't walk past that. I had to help. She paused, her hand still for a moment before continuing. But what happened next surprised me. I thought I was helping one family. Instead, I became part of a movement. Richard didn't just learn sign language. He learned humility. He learned to listen. He learned that people without money or power often have the wisdom that wealthy, powerful people need, and he used his resources to amplify voices that society usually ignores. Clara looked at Richard and Sophie. This family taught me that healing is possible, that connection across difference is possible, that when we truly see each other, really see each other, we can change the world. One relationship at a time. One conversation at a time. One moment of understanding at a time. The audience applauded, hands waving. Sophie stood up and joined Clara at the front, signing her own thoughts. I'm deaf. That's part of who I am. For a long time I thought that made me less than other people, less than hearing people. But Clara taught me that I'm not less. I'm different. And different is beautiful. My dad learned to enter my world instead of forcing me to exist only in his. And now we're helping other families do the same thing. Sophie paused, her young face serious. If you're a hearing parent with a deaf child, learn sign language. Not just a few signs. Really learn it. Become fluent in your child's language. Let them see that you think their world is worth entering. Let them see deaf adults who are successful and happy. Let them be proud of who they are. More applause. Sophie smiled, her confidence growing with each word. That evening, after the event ended, Richard, Sophie, and Clara sat together in Richard's study. They'd started a tradition of having dinner together once a week, the three of them signing and laughing and being family. Can I tell you something? Sophie signed. When Grandma died, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never be happy again. But losing her led me to find Clara, and finding Clara led Dad to change. And all of that led to the foundation that's helping so many people. So maybe Grandma dying wasn't just sad. Maybe it was also the start of something important. I think your grandmother would love that perspective, Clara signed. She'd love that you found meaning in loss, that you transformed grief into purpose. Do you still miss your mom? Sophie asked Clara. Every day, Clara signed honestly. Missing people doesn't stop. But it changes. It becomes softer, less sharp. You learn to carry it without being crushed by it. Richard watched his daughter and the woman who'd saved her, conversing in the language that connected them. He thought about how much had changed in 2 years. How much he'd changed, from a man who thought money solved everything to someone who understood that love, presence, and understanding mattered more than any amount of wealth. He thought about the hundreds of families the foundation was serving, the deaf kids who were growing up proud instead of ashamed, the hearing parents who were learning to see their children as whole, complete people, the deaf adults who finally had a wealthy ally willing to fund their visions and amplify their voices, all because Clara had seen a suffering child and refused to look away. I want to tell you both something, Richard signed. I used to think success meant building a business empire, making money, having power, but real success is this, right here. Being able to communicate with my daughter, being part of a community, using my resources to help people who need it. This is what matters. This is what life is really about. You've come a long way. Clara signed with a smile. From a man who barely noticed his housekeeping staff to someone who understands that every person has value and wisdom to offer. You taught me that, Richard signed. You taught me to really see people, all people, not just those with money or credentials or status. Everyone. Sophie leaned against her father on one side and Clara on the other. Three people from different worlds connected by crisis and choice, by language and love. I'm writing a paper for school about heroes, Sophie signed. Can I write about you, Auntie Clara? Clara shook her head. I'm not a hero, baby. I just did what anyone should do when they see someone suffering. I helped. That's exactly what makes you a hero, Sophie signed. You saw someone who needed help and you gave it. Even though it wasn't your job. Even though nobody asked you to. You just did it because it was right. That's what heroes do.